All right, let's get into it. Appreciate you guys joining me today. My name is Matt Hiraga. I'm going to be your instructor for this course. You are going to take OSHA lead in construction. Now, the purpose of the course is to help you understand what is lead, how does it affect you medically as far as effects it can have on your body, things like proper disposal, transportation, control. We are going to discuss personal protective equipment, respiratory requirements, job site setups with regards to containment. And you do have to understand things like critical barriers, lead caution tape, so on and so forth. So I am going to share my screen with you. You guys are going to be able to take a look at the PowerPoint as I roll along. Feel free to pause anytime you need to take a break. Keep in mind that taking notes is recommended. You can screenshot if you would like. There is a competency test at the end. Again, this is an OSHA lead course. It can be used as your initial or as a recertification. This is a 1-year certification. Buckle up and get ready to ride. Sharing my screen now. Okay, so let's take a look here at the PowerPoint. This is lead awareness training. Let's dip right into it. Now, training requirements. It is required that you have this training if you are exposed to lead at or above the action level, or if you suffer from skin irritation or eye irritation from lead. Now, the action level, if you don't yet understand, is typically something where OSHA and NIOSH, which is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, says that you and your company have to take action to acknowledge that this hazard or this chemical is a problem for you. So an action level is when your company has to have a written program. An action level is where you have to provide specific training and then possibly do medical surveillance. The term more people are common with is PEL. That is your permissible exposure limit. How much are you as a worker allowed to be exposed to in an 8-hour day? PEL is based on an 8-hour day, 40 hours a week, or up to 2,000 hours a year. Okay? This includes any specific job hazards from lead, personal protective measures that need to be taken, any engineering controls, and then work practices that are done. So protective measures may be we're going to create a containment. We are going to use a full face respirator or a half face respirator with P100 filters. An engineering control is going to be we're going to set up negative air machines. We are going to utilize HEPA vacuums to minimize exposure. And then best work practices could be we're going to educate our workers on not doing things like dry sweeping. We're going to utilize wet methods to minimize any airborne dust. You should also understand the dangers of lead to your body and how it can affect you or kids or anybody that is possibly exposed. And then you should have accessibility to your company's written programs and then any regulations, whether it be from the Department of Health, whether it be from OSHA or the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, that's typically found in your office with the safety department, upper management, project management also has accessibility to any written programs, policies, or procedures. And you can request that anytime you want if that's something that you want to review so you can take your company standpoint on the requirement. And then you should have a description of your medical surveillance program, whether they send you to an annual physical, whether you get fit tested, whether you have to do pulmonary function testing. There is a reason for all that kind of stuff. And there's also a medical removal program. What happens when your worker is exposed to lead at or above the permissible exposure limit? Now, keep in mind that the permissible exposure limit is put into place assuming you're not wearing any personal protective equipment. So there is no respiratory protection, but you can still breathe this for 8 hours a day. When you have things like a respirator on, or you're using an SCBA or a PAPR, whatever it may be, then it's going to affect what that number actually represents. But you still should know what everything means. Now, what is lead? It is a heavy metal at room temperature. It's typically a bluish gray color and has a low melting point, which can be beneficial for manufacturing, processing, so on and so forth. It's pliable, which means it's easy to work with. It is corrosion resistant, and then it can form other lead compounds. Now, corrosion resistant pliable is typically why they use it in a lot of manufacturing or paints. They're going to use it in high temperature areas. They're going to use it in where you would have water exposure, like on window frames, doors, things like kitchens or bathrooms. It's more commonly where you're going to find lead. Now, the actual dangers of lead, pure lead is PB. It is a heavy metal at room temperature and pressure, a basic chemical element, and it can be combined with various other substances to form numerous lead compounds. Lead has been poisoning workers for thousands of years. Now, lead can damage things like your central nervous system, your cardiovascular system, reproductive system, any hematological systems and kidneys. When you absorb it into your body at a high enough dose, lead can be toxic. And if you notice the skull and crossbones, it's considered a poison, which means it could be fatal. Now, your central nervous system, when you think about that, that is where your brain connects to your body, and your motor functions and speech and things like that can be affected. Your cardiovascular system, that's your heart, your lungs, the things that help you to absorb oxygen in your body, super, super dangerous. When you talk reproductive system for women, it may affect your ovaries. It may, if you definitely don't be doing lead abatement if you're pregnant or may become pregnant, if you're things like breastfeeding. And then for men, the soldier doesn't necessarily work the way it should. It affects your reproductive. You may not be able to produce those little swimmers, things like that. So just kind of keep those things in mind on how it can affect you. Now, what products with lead commonly found in? Gasoline is going to be amongst the top where it used to be used. And that's why nowadays, when you fill up, they say, unleaded gas, because it used to be leaded. Smelting processes, lead batteries account for probably one of the most commonly used lead, at least in the United States, if you take a look at those percentages. Things like paints and coatings, solder, auto manufacturing, printing, and then other construction products like liners, shielding, waterproofing. For example, some of the fireproofing and fire stopping equipment that is still being sold can contain lead. Now, the history of lead, in the late 1950s, paint manufacturers voluntarily reduced lead content for most paint for residential use. Now, when the manufacturer of a product starts to voluntarily reduce something, that should give a pretty clear indication that, well, they know something is wrong with it. It's doing something in a negative fashion, because you're not going to change a product that works if it doesn't pose a big hazard. They were starting to get people sick in the manufacturing plants. They were realizing that people were falling ill, people were dying because of the product that they produced being used, so they voluntarily reduced it. In 1978, and this is a key year to remember, 1978 was a big changing point for hazardous materials like lead, asbestos. This is where they started to regulate it. This is where they said, okay, you're regulating it to 600 parts per million. And that's back in the 70s. Still dangerous, still hazardous, could still kill you, but it was a step in the right direction. Now, lead paint for non-residential use is still being sold. So if I want to paint my warehouse, or I want to do a military ship, right, I can use lead-based paint for its strength and its corrosion resistance. So it's not illegal. They just kind of outcasted it partially for residential use. Now, where's lead paint found? Before 1950, you could find it everywhere. Inside, outside, your baby's room, in the kitchen, sitting next to your stove. Right? And between the 50s and 60s, it was probably still outside, but may still be inside. They use it on things like trims, doors, windows, kitchens, and bathrooms. Again, anything where you're going to get that high moisture or water possibility. And then between 60 and 78, maybe outside, and less likely inside. There is no exact science to this. If it sat on the shelf at your local Sherwin-Williams for 10 years and you decided to buy it because it was on sale and discounted, you could have painted it after any specific time. So this isn't a guarantee. It should still be tested prior to disturbing. And then that's going to give you an idea of how you should handle it. Do I need to set up containments? Do I need to use personal protective equipment? And then it may affect even how you dispose of the materials. Now, what is lead paint? It is a chemical element with the atomic number 82. And it is a heavy metal with a density that exceeds that of most common materials. It is soft, malleable, and it melts at a relatively low temperature. Lead exposure limits. So when you look at NIOSH, again, that's the National Institute of Occupational Safety. These guys are OSHA's sister company, and they have what's called a recommended exposure limit. We recommend you probably should not go over this number, and that is 50 micrograms per cubic meter of air over a 8-hour time-weighted average, right? Now, subsequently, OSHA's permissible exposure limit, which is more commonly used, especially in construction, is also 50 micrograms per cubic meter of air. So they match, and they agreed, and they said, yeah, this is the number that a worker could legally breathe 8 hours a day with no respiratory protection, 40 hours a week, 2,000, 50 hours a year, depending on if it's leap year, and you should be okay. Now, we don't like to work on should. Best practices tell you protect so that there is no exposure. So even if you're right at that borderline, wear your respirator. Use a dust mask at the very least, right? Don't take your chances saying we don't have to do it. Downgrading PPE normally isn't the best results. Okay? And then when you look at it, most common sources of lead poisoning happen from deterioration of lead-based paints, any lead-contaminated dust, whether it be because you disturbed it, you were dry sweeping it, you shot it down with, an air compressor, and then lead-contaminated residential and commercial soil. Now, a lot of this happens because you have loose and flaking paint on the exterior of the building. It's constantly falling when the wind's blowing and it rains, and it gets into your dirt, or the guy with the weed whacker comes and smacks the side of your building while cutting your grass. It contaminates the soil. So when you go in there and I'm going to plant my little lemon tree, you may be exposing yourself just from that type of activity. Now, looking at occupational exposures to lead, construction activities like demolition or salvaging of structures that contain lead paint, and typically for abatement companies, that's exactly what you're hired to do, is go in there and remove all of this hazard, because we are remodeling, or we are going to demolish this building. Okay? Removal or encapsulation of lead materials, utilizing things like scraping, heating, sanding, grinding, or blasting. Any alteration, repair, or renovation of structures. Now, you see that when they kind of mention this bullet point. In addition to taking just this OSHA lead course, it is recommended that you take a lead RRP, renovation, repair, and painting of lead surfaces, so that you understand how to do paint chip sampling. You understand how to take a sample using a lead check test kit. Or at the very least, you understand, well, is this a child-occupied facility? And what does that mean? Is this a target housing by definition, which tells you it was built before 78, right? There may be some additional requirements that need to be done, not just, come here, cut out all my drywall that's painted in lead-based paint, and then throw it in my neighbor's trash can. That's not always the option, okay? Transportation. I can't throw it in the back of my buddy's Nissan hard body truck and he lets it bounce in the back, on his way to the landfill. Disposal and cleanup of the contaminated materials, right? Not only the debris that you removed, it could be the plastic that you had dropped on the ground, critical barriers, gloves you were wearing, Tyvek suits you were wearing, all that kind of stuff, or even the lead waste that collects inside of the HEPA vac. You don't just leave it, right, for the next people. And then you got to consider maintenance operations. If I call the HVAC guy to come clean my air filters, or I got to repair a broken fan belt, or hey, can you fix the hydraulic pump on this big metal door that has lead paint on it? I may be exposing other people who come in for simple things like maintenance and upkeep. Now, there's two common ways that lead does enter your body. Breathing it in, or aspiration, is the number one way. If you imagine it, if you've ever experienced secondhand smoke, it's hard to avoid. I get it everywhere I go. I take my kids out, so it's very noticeable for me that I always seem to be exposed to something that I don't myself do. So inhalation is a real big problem. And then ingestion, surprisingly enough. Now, people who are eating, people who are snacking when they come out of the work area, or I'm on my 15-minute break, so I'm going to drink some water, or I'm going to take a smoke break. Unsanitary hands inadvertently are going to be putting this hazardous chemical possibly into your body based on the activity that you're doing. So you got to remember to utilize good hygiene. They tell you in any type of hazardous materials class that you take that the simple fact that you smoke is increasing your chance of exposure, or at least becoming ill or developing a disease or a problem 50 times more than non-smokers. 50. That is really, you're sticking a finger somewhere that you don't want to. Don't let fate come get you. Okay. So when is lead paint a hazard? According to the EPA standard, Environmental Protection Agency, and that's the interesting thing about working with hazardous materials. You're not only concerned with what OSHA says you have to do. You got to be concerned with the Department of Health and what do you have to do, and Environmental Protection Agency, and what do they say to do? All of these entities can write you violations. They can write you fines. They can cost you money, shut down your job sites. They can take you to court, right? Things like that. It says that paint a friction surface where dust below exceeds a hazardous amount is dangerous, right? If you exceed any hazardous amount. Damage paint to an impacted surface. If I smash into your fence because I was driving my car and it had lead-based paint, that's an impacted surface. If I'm hammering on a metal door because it was bent, but it had lead-based paint. Any chewable surface where there's evidence of teeth marks. Think about school, preschools, elementary. Remember that funny kid that used to chew on the desk? If it was painted in lead-based paint, that's a problem. Window frames, window sills. Think of that number 2 pencil. Well, what is the pencil material made of, right? It's chewable surface that have evidence of teeth marks. Hazardous, and then any deteriorated lead-based paint in no size amount. Loose and flaky everywhere you go, that becomes a hazardous problem in the eyes of the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, look at this hazard. It says that hazardous paint is anything greater than or equal to 40 micrograms per square foot of dust. When you look at it, now it's giving you a little example, right? If you sand 1 square foot of paint that contained 1 microgram per cubic centimeter or per square centimeter, that is going to result in 93,000 micrograms per square foot of lead dust on the floor. It tells you it's dangerous above 40. If I did 1 square foot of sanding, it gives me 93,000. Well, that means if I look at the paint, I'll probably be above the what's safe, right? And that's why they don't allow you to do things like that. Worst case scenario, you're going to go take an orbital sander or grinder to the surface. Realistically, you probably got to create an enclosed containment. You should be using negative air machines. You should be definitely using a shrouded tool that has a HEPA vacuum attachment to it to suck up some of the dust. They may require wet methods. Okay, you got to soak the wall first and have a guy standing there with a Hudson sprayer minimizing any airborne dust, because they know that if you're using anything mechanical on lead paint, it just creates too much dust too quickly. Okay. Now, health effects. Health effects are something obviously very important. This is the why to why do I have to wear this, right? Lead, which is inhaled or ingested, gets into your bloodstream. And if you're not familiar, your heart is pumping oxygenated blood throughout your entire body. When you get things into your bloodstream, it circulates amongst your body, okay? It can be circulated throughout the body. Some is excreted while some remains in organs and body tissues. If the exposure continues, the amount of stored in your body will increase. And if you're absorbing more than you can excrete, it becomes a problem. Now, taking a look at this pictogram, and you should recognize what a pictogram looks like if you've ever taken any hazard communication, if you've seen a safety data sheet or just a product label. They should all have them at this point. This is a new standard that was effective December 31st of 2013. So we're at that like 7-year mark now that you should have an understanding. When you see any black picture that is surrounded with a red diamond frame and a white background, that is a pictogram, and you should know what it means. Looking at this pictogram, it tells me that it is a health hazard. It could be a target organ toxic kind of substance. It may cause cancer, affect your kidney, affect your lungs. You see that little symbol on the chest? It's a carcinogen. That means don't breathe it in because it's a big problem for you, right? When it becomes airborne is where it's easy to breathe in. So this is something that is very hazardous and can cause a problem. Now, health effects. During prolonged chronic exposure, many body systems can be affected by lead, including your brain and kidneys, muscles and bones, blood forming and reproductive systems. Reported acute health effects include flu-like illnesses, encephalopathy, coma, and death, right? That's a big problem. Death is always something you don't want to be playing with. Your blood system, it could impair the production of heme, which carries oxygen to body tissues. Your central nervous system, it damages the central nervous system and brain tissue. Urinary systems, it damages your kidneys. And then look at reproductive system. It can make you sterile. It has a decreased sex drive, impotence in men. It means you can't get them to stand up, miscarriages, menstrual disturbances, and then crosses into the placenta in women. That means you're actually affecting your unborn baby by the exposure. Here's a list of some common symptoms. And when you look at this, it's unfortunately can be confused with a lot of other things, but loss of appetite, constipation, nausea, excessive tiredness, headache, fine tremors, colic with severe abdominal pain, metallic taste in the mouth, weakness, nervous irritability, hyperactivity, muscle and joint pain or soreness, anxiety, pallor, insomnia, numbness, and dizziness. What's crazy is you look at it, excessive tiredness, but hyperactivity. Some of these things kind of contradict each other. And then this is just showing you examples of how it can affect your brain, headaches, tired all the time, irritability, moodiness. I feel like I have this without lead exposure, but those are common symptoms of the exposure. Okay. It can affect blood forming systems like your heart, cardiovascular system, bone marrow inside, nausea, constipation, diarrhea. You can't take Pepto-Bismol to solve your lead. You just have to be removed from your exposure, and then your body naturally has to help fight it out, or they're going to have to give you certain medicines that help force out the lead in your body. Okay. Kidneys and reproductive systems, it just kind of shows how and why it affects you. And then health effects of lead exposure. So symptoms of chronic lead exposure could be loss of appetite, right? We talked about that. Insomnia, headaches, nausea, dizziness, so on and so forth. Now, how is it measured? The PEL, you are allowed to be exposed to up to the permissible exposure limit established by OSHA of 50 micrograms per cubic meter of air based on an 8-hour average. Now, 50 is your PEL, right? Your recommended exposure limit is 30 micrograms, which is also your action level, so that at that point you have to take action, have the programs, policies, procedures, protection in place at 30. Legally, you can be exposed to 50. And then to be a little bit more confusing, they added in that, well, here's what's considered hazardous above 40, right? And that's set by EPA. So everybody has a little dip in the regulation, but 30 tells you have to have a plan. 40 considers it dangerous. 50 is the maximum exposure with no PPE. And if you go above 50, then you better start doing some engineering controls, adding water, adding vacuums, adding neg airs, things like that. Okay? And then exposure monitoring. Initial air monitoring and determination includes employee complaints, of symptoms which may be attributed to exposure lead. If action level has been exceeded, which is 30, then the air monitoring program is required. So if you've ever exceeded 30 micrograms on any job site, then you have to do air monitoring, whether you're hiring a third-party hygienist or you're doing OSHA's or your own personal sampling. If you're exposed to lead, you must be notified in writing of the air monitoring results. So when you guys are taking things like your personal samples or the hygienist is on site, if your work activity pushed you above the permissible exposure limit, then your company creates and generates a letter saying, hey, on this project at this time, or they post it, right? So they post it in the warehouse on the message board where it shows the job, it shows the worker who was there, and it shows what they were exposed to. Now, you don't panic if you're at 51 micrograms per cubic meter of air, because remember that most of your jobs are going to require protection. For example, if you're using a half-face respirator, it gives you what's called an assigned protection factor of 10. That means 10 times the amount is what you can possibly be exposed to. So if they say lead is dangerous at 50 and I was wearing a half-face, lead becomes dangerous to me now if it's above 500. So the PPE kicks in, and then when you wear a full face respirator, you can get an assigned protection factor of up to 50 times, right? So 2,500 is where your exposure should have been if you were wearing the full face, where it would then become a problem. Okay? So no need to panic because you see it slightly elevated. If you have questions, then you ask. You ask somebody in the office, you ask your project manager, your superintendent, your safety guy, whatever you got to do. Now, if you're exposed to lead, you must be notified in writing. If the PEL is exceeded, you will be informed in writing of the air monitoring results and a description of the correction action being taken. So basically we say, well, next time we're going to utilize more negative pressure. Next time we're going to use more water, or we're going to require that instead of a half face, you have to use a full face. If the exposure is between the action level of 30 and the permissible exposure level of 50, then the exposure is checked every 6 months. That means that if we do that activity, we need to go back and reevaluate it every 6 months to see if it's being made better or worse. And then if it's over the PEL, air monitoring is conducted every 3 months on that specific job task. Medical surveillance program. Workers that are exposed to lead above the action level must be in a medical surveillance program. So if you get above the 30 micrograms, basically you have to be surveyed on a yearly basis. This includes blood tests for lead, blood lead levels, zinc prototyping, things like that. Does not include tissue or organ information. You do medical examinations. We remove lead-exposed workers from any at-risk jobs. Okay? And then they use certain drugs to help get rid of the lead if you are a little too high. The medical removal protection, again, basically what it does is it removes the worker from any lead-based activities if they are exposed higher than the permissible exposure limit and their blood results come back elevated. So that means that you have to take them out on the job, you put them into a different position. You're not going to get affected by pay cuts, decreases, or increases. And this is a maximum of 18 months. So a year and a half, you can actually be pulled off a project if your level of exposure is extremely high, or at least your contamination in your blood lead is way too high. Now, engineering controls. Shrouded tools provide exhaust ventilation at a point where the dust is generated. For example, you take a handheld grinder, it has the shroud with a HEPA vac. This is an engineering control. If you use a high-efficiency particulate air filter on vacuums, that means it's capable of causing containing 99.97% of dust, and that's down to 0.3 microns, which is awesomely small. Okay, so that's what a HEPA filter is. And that is the equivalent filter when you're utilizing a P100 on your respirator. P just tells you it's oil proof, right? R would be oil resistant. N would be not oil resistant, like an N95 dust mask. So that is the equivalent of a HEPA vacuum filter. And then here's some examples of the PPE you would be using, right? Whether it be respirators. Respirators cannot be used without a physical, basically saying that you are fit, right? They do pulmonary testing, saying this person can handle restricted breathing, so they can wear a respirator. And then you have to have an annual fit test. Keep in mind, anytime you wear a respirator, you have to be clean shaven in the area that the mask is going to be touching your face. So anywhere the mask makes contact with your face, no facial hair. And then if you have facial hair that's not touching it cannot interfere with the movement of the one-way valve. Your respirator is going to have at least 3 one-way valves, right? 2 on your filter inhale and then 1 on your exhale. The hair cannot affect the movement of that valve. Personal protective Tyvek suits, they come equipped with hood and boots. Those boots cannot be ripped, removed, or altered, and the hoods need to be worn over your respirator, but under a hard hat. And then shoes typically have to go inside of the Tyvek suit if it's regular work boots. The exception is if you're using steel-toed or plated-toed rubber boots that can be worn on the outside of the Tyvek suit, assuming you tape or duct tape the top to prevent anything from going into the shoe, because those shoes can be easily cleaned off with water and some type of surfactant solution. Remember, you have to dust off any clothes in the work area, utilize a HEPA vac on some type of a drop cloth, and clean up before coming out. And then this is just more examples of where lead could be found, right? So it says, in your home, if it was built before 1978, it may contain lead-based paints. Hobbies like stained glass, home remodeling or painting, recreational target shooting, melting lead for fishing weights, lead glazing in ceramics. Non-occupational exposures could be backyard scrap metal recycling, leaded crystal, tableware, cookware, folk remedies, things like that. So for housekeeping, it says use exhaust ventilation to capture dust or fumes whenever possible. HEPA vacuum, dust-covered work surfaces, dry sweeping or compressed air is prohibited, and wet methods may be used, introducing water. Do not eat, drink, smoke, or apply cosmetics in areas where the lead is present. And this kind of reminds you that when you're creating your work area, you need to delineate that work area far enough back from exposure, and basically anything within those caution tape, you should not have your water bottles, you shouldn't have your bag of lunch, whatever it may be, food, you shouldn't be smoking within that area. That is a designated working area. Everything else has to happen outside. Okay. Wash your hands and face after doing any lead work. You can use lead wipes. You could use a 5-gallon bucket with a clean rag and water, things like that. And then wear protective clothing to avoid getting dust on your clothes and then bringing it to home to your spouse and children. Now, typically, as much as possible, you don't want to wear any cotton in a containment area. And a best practice would be utilizing, just something like surf shorts and no t-shirt, no pants, things like that. Surf shorts works good, especially when you have that polyester kind of blend. So housekeeping, your signage, the sign needs to be posted anywhere you're going to be above the PEL at any point. It'll read something like warning, lead work area, poison, no smoking or eating, authorized personnel, caution, keep out, right? And then record keeping. Now, record keeping for exposure monitoring, it must be maintained for 40 years or for the duration of your employment plus 20 years. So it doesn't matter if you work there for a week when you leave, the record's got to be kept for at least 20 years or a total of 40 years. So if you work 20 and then retire, got to keep it for another 20, 40 total as far as exposure, because you could have long-term effects and it needs to be able to be traced or tracked back to when it could have possibly happened. You don't want to be one of those guys when you're watching TV at 2 a.m. Have you or a loved one ever lost somebody to this killer thing, right? Call now, our lawyers are waiting. That becomes a problem. Medical surveillance, it's same as the exposure monitoring. So it needs to be kept for 40 years or employment plus 20. And then your medical removal is just during the duration of employment. It needs to track when you're removed from a job, for how long, and so on. You should have a lead management plan. This is typically paperwork that's done prior to the job starting, and this is included in the bid process, but steps to take before you disturb lead suspected paint. When in doubt, determine if the paint contains lead prior to disturbing. Notify facilities management prior to disturbance. Consult with the general contractor when the work is contracted. Inform contractors in writing of the presence of lead, and then ensure that all work is conducted according to the proper practices, right? And that's what you guys learn as far as how to handle an abatement and so on and so forth. Okay. So, I'm just switching back here. There's some buttons that need to be pressed. Stop sharing. Cool. That is your training class in a nutshell with regards to OSHA lead requirements and understanding what it is, When am I going to be exposed to it? What kind of materials contain it? How can it affect me and my body? For more questions, always ask and don't assume. Um, Thank you for taking the class today. Enjoy, and I'll see you guys on the flip side.